Gosh, this is great. Glad all of you could be here today. I'm not going to be able to tell a better story than you did, so I appreciate the story involved there. I'm going to start with a few words about Route 66. I also want to have a chance to say some things about this corridor preservation program, so let's get started. First, a few words about Route 66. Let's see. As Nat King Cole crooned in 1946, it winds from Chicago to LA, 2,000 miles all the way. The love of the highway means that Route 66 was a magical place because it headed to Southern California, land of sun, Hollywood, and prosperity. A lot of people equate Route 66, called the Mother Road, with America's love affair with the automobile and the freedom of the open road. As author Michael Wallace said, Route 66 will always mean going somewhere. Americans, in fact, have long had a love affair with Route 66, even after the freeways took over the remaining segments in the mid-1980s. So in 1999, Congress designated the Route 66 Corridor Preservation Program. One federal employee runs this program, and you can see her right up there, Kaisa Barthuli. She administers a small grant program that might help restore a road sign, refurbish a short order cafe, or an inventory of Route 66 bridges or businesses. This gives a kind of a rundown of the kind of total projects that have been given maybe $100,000 to $200,000 per year. Once again, it shows some examples of the rehabilitation and investigations that we've done over the years, and that gives kind of a year-by-year and state-by-state breakdown of the kind of projects that we do. So if you run a cafe in Stroud, Oklahoma, and it dates back to the Route 66 period, we want to help. So if you have some interests or concerns along that line, let me know. Today, a lot of people think of Route 66 in terms of tail fins, poodle skirts, a red Corvette, and driving with the wind in your hair. And as you look into the literature, essentially all of the Route 66 imagery is based on white experiences. But not everybody enjoyed the same freedom of the open road as others. Black Americans, for example, love to hit the open road like everybody else, but the racial attitudes of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s forced black motorists to adapt and plan ahead. That didn't stop them from getting out on the open road. And even so, despite those barriers, thousands of black motorists hopped onto Route 66 and headed to California. It's the Western aspect that I'd like to chat about for the next few minutes, because there's a fairly solid body of literature, both popular and more academic stuff, that's faced on black motorists in the East, the Midwest, and the South. But again, and there have also been some articles about black guidebooks, but once again, concentrating on those same areas. So I'm using the Route 66 area as a template for what it must have been like for a black family, perhaps a black businessman, what it was like if they took a driving trip out Route 66 to the Great Plains, to the Mountain West, or to the Pacific Coast. So, what was it like to be a black motorist in the mid-20th century? Let's see. To understand that, we'll begin with the Great Migration. By 1926, when Route 66 was born, more than 1 million black Americans had left the rural South in search of better opportunities. Many of them headed for New York and Chicago, but a few went west to California. Life in the Jim Crow South promised poverty and overt, legally sanctioned discrimination. The big northern cities, by contrast, offered both manufacturing and service jobs. Let's see, I went a little bit too far there. Blacks in the northern cities attained a new collective identity, and in some areas they brought about a cultural renaissance. Social conditions in the North, however, were by no means rosy. Blacks faced discrimination there as well, but in less obvious ways, in housing, schools, jobs. One major manifestation of Northern discrimination, so it was spoken about just a moment ago, primarily in rural areas, was the sundown town. Sociologist James Loewen, there on the left, he grew up in the central Illinois town of Decatur and noted that black residential patterns resembled a checkerboard, that some cities and towns had a fairly sizable number of black residents, but adjacent cities or counties had very few. Some people thought that this pattern was coincidental, maybe varying economic opportunities or just historical happenstance. Loewen, however, argued that white prejudice may have played a strong role in these sundown towns. And a sundown town is a place that has 10 or fewer black residents. And he backs it up with quite a few historical anecdotes about prospective black residents being asked to leave town before sundown. Between 1890 and 1940, he notes, many Midwestern towns had expelled their black residents, or they'd taken strong measures to prevent blacks from ever settling there. Based on Loewen's research, I couldn't help but ask, do these patterns hold in the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountain states, or out on the Pacific coast? So to be more specific, when black travelers headed west from Chicago along Route 66, were sundown towns the rule or the exception? So I did a little research, went to the census, and just went right down the list of every town along Route 66. And so what this shows as a summary chart, and sorry if the numbers throw you, but what it shows is that both in 1930, which are those two left-hand columns, and 1950, which is the two right-hand columns, you can see that the total number of towns and the number of sundown towns. So in Illinois, which is where Loewen did his initial research, you can see that in 1930, about a third of the towns were sundown towns. By 1950, about a little over a quarter of them were. So I thought, okay, headed out into the West where racial discrimination was less obvious, were there fewer sundown towns? And the answer is not at all. But the key question here is why so many cities and towns? There's really no historical causality. For instance, in New Mexico, there were a number of towns that were on Indian reservations. Does that mean that they were sundown towns because of historical, white prejudice? Probably not. But unless somebody gets out there and does the field work, we'll never know. But regardless, the take-home message for blacks that drove Route 66 was that a large number of villages and small towns all along the route were sundown towns, and so the safe choice was to go to the larger cities where there was at least the possibility of a black neighborhood with its own hotels, tourist homes, and restaurants. July 2nd, 1964, President Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act into law. One of the act's most controversial elements was Title II, which outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations. Before that, however, patterns of prejudices along Route 66 had created an unstable racial geography. Discrimination, as it turned out, varied considerably both between states and within states. In Illinois, for example, racial discrimination was officially forbidden. This fellow, John Thomas, he was a state assembly member from Chicago. He saw to it that the Illinois legislature passed a bill stating that all Illinois residents had equal access to hotels, restaurants, transportation, and other public accommodation. That law, however, was widely ignored. Chicago, which had a large and growing population due to the Great Migration, witnessed some fairly early social change, thanks to sit-ins and other nonviolent actions starting in the mid-1940s. blacks in Chicago slowly gained access to most public accommodations. Downstate, however, Illinois retained age-old patterns of de facto discrimination. In Bloomington, for example, blacks sat in the crow's nest, the balcony, of movie theaters, and few restaurants served black patrons. By the early 1960s, conditions seemed to be ripe for change. So a civil rights group, CORE, tried to integrate these towns by announcing a series of restaurant sit-ins, but it didn't work. As late as 1963, just a year before the act was passed, a restaurant owner in a small town along Route 66 in Illinois announced that he refused to serve blacks because he chose to serve only those customers he personally chose to accommodate, quote, unquote. In Missouri, which had once been a slave state, the story was much the same. Some St. Louis lunch counters and hotels were integrated by the mid-1950s, and by 1960, the city had opened up all of its restaurants to blacks. But elsewhere along Route 66 in Missouri, segregation remained as firmly entrenched as it always had been. In Oklahoma, Southern-style segregation was the law of the land until August 1958, when an Oklahoma City teacher, Clara Looper, led a sit-in at a local drugstore. That action brought on other protests that slowly integrated the city's restaurants, theaters, and hotels. In Tulsa, the civil rights demonstrations were led by a coalition of ministers who worked with youth groups to integrate restaurants, shops, pools, and parks. Oklahoma's small towns, however, had to await the passage of federal legislation. In Texas, which had been part of the Confederacy, and where separate restrooms and drinking fountains were the norm, the integration of public facilities did not take place, either in Amarillo or anywhere else in the Panhandle, until the Civil Rights Act was passed. Now you head west from Texas and you're in New Mexico, where multiculturalism was the norm, and blacks ranked a distant fourth place behind Anglos, Hispanics, and American Indians. This is just a census chart that shows that blacks were demographically pretty far down in terms of the rankings. So the attitudes in blacks depended on where one lived. Residents of southern and eastern New Mexico had a lot in common with their Texas neighbors. In fact, even today, a lot of eastern and southern New Mexico is called Little Texas, while Santa Fe and Albuquerque were generally more tolerant. In Albuquerque, in 1952, the City Commission passed a groundbreaking ordinance that prohibited discrimination in all public accommodations. And 3 years later, the New Mexico legislature did the same thing. It was the first statewide measure in the Intermountain West. But neither the city ordinance nor the state law had any enforcement mechanism, so change was slow and occasional backsliding took place. And in 1955, somebody from the local NAACP decided to go right up and down Central Avenue, which was the main tourist corridor in Albuquerque, and just pound on the doors of all the motels. There were about 100 of them, and said, you know, if I tried to be able to get a hotel room, would you let me? I asked 100 people, 6 of them said yes. So an occasional backsliding took place, such as in 1960, a dark-skinned UNM student from South Asia was refused service at an Albuquerque restaurant. In Arizona, just as in New Mexico, blacks ranked fourth in population. Along the Route 66 corridor, typically blacks worked in one of several timber companies or for the Santa Fe Railroad. Racial progress was slow. In both Winslow and Flagstaff, along Route 66, non-Anglo residents, this means American Indians and Hispanics as well as blacks, had to sit upstairs in the movie theaters, and in Flagstaff, the local sheriff enforced a ban against blacks eating in white-owned restaurants. Outside of Flagstaff and Winslow, relations with blacks were hardly an issue. As late as 1950, the town of Williams, the gateway to the Grand Canyon, had 2 black residents. Kingman had 1. At the far western end of Route 66, the LA area had been home to thousands of blacks since the 1890s. Thanks to the efforts of Assemblyman Henry Clay Dibble, he's there on the top right, the state passed a civil rights law in 1897, and 20 years later, Frederick Madison Roberts, down in the lower left, he strengthened that law. Just as in Illinois, however, the law was rarely enforced. In the late 1930s, Duke Ellington, you see him there just getting off a Pullman car in Los Angeles, Duke was refused service at a white-owned Los Angeles hotel, and black residents were routinely barred from hotels and restaurants. But in 1959, the legislature passed the Unruh Civil Rights Act. That's Jesse Unruh there on the right. And that act increased fines for business owners who refused to serve black patrons. Most black travelers who headed west on Route 66, not surprisingly, didn't know this complexity of civil rights laws. So, as one black resident and one black scholar noted, how a colored man can be expected to know all the intricacies of segregation as he travels in different parts of the country is beyond explanation. The truth of the matter is, he is expected to find out as best as he can. Given the humiliation of train travel with its Jim Crow cars and bus travel where blacks were forced to take a back seat, driving the highways gave blacks a considerable degree of freedom and anonymity. The side of the highway, however, was not free. So blacks, as one historian noted, quote, did all they could to insulate themselves, and particularly their children, from unpleasant confrontations with whites. One major way to make driving more comfortable was to use a guidebook. During the late 1920s, when Route 66 was a newly designated highway, black motorists had few ways of knowing which hotels and restaurants would serve them. Some sought advice from friends and relatives, while others tried to get help from the NAACP or the Negro Welfare League. In 1930, however, the first travel guide that catered to a black audience was published. It provided much needed information to travelers who hoped to avoid, as one guidebook tactfully stated, embarrassment and inconvenience. Then in 1937, the first volume of the Negro Motorist Green Book was published by New York travel agent Victor Green and his wife Alma. The Green Book quickly gained in popularity. It offered hotel and restaurant listings throughout the United States. Many of its listings, however, pertain to New York, Chicago, and other northern cities, but listings were scattered all over the country. The success of the Green Book brought on competitors such as Smith's Tour, and I'm sorry about the lousy graphics, these are Xeroxes of Xeroxes, brought on competitors such as Smith's Tourist Guide, the Travel Guide, Grayson's Travel and Business Guide, and the Go Guide. They all serve much the same purpose as the Green Book, but none of these competitors had the staying power or enjoyed the broad circulation of the Green Book, which indeed in 1962, the Green Book had a circulation of 2 million copies, and they were available at low cost, 75 cents or $1, at Esso stations and other Standard Oil outlets. Not all black motorists, however, used a travel guide to help them along. So how did blacks travel? They fell back on a broad range of well-honed strategies that helped them survive in a hostile environment. Many families, for example, simply drove straight through, driving all night long if necessary. They packed picnic baskets of food and stopped only at gas stations and when nature called. Others learned from friends to avoid certain towns that had a reputation for discrimination or violence. A strategy some people employed was to go to the train station and ask questions from a Pullman porter, while others drove down the main street looking for a black resident. Or they might ask a white passerby, "Where can we get something to eat?" or where can we find a room for the night? Blacks who recall travels over Route 66 in those days do not remember it fondly. Irv Logan from Springfield, Missouri, recalls that if you were a person of color in the 1940s and 1950s, you couldn't rent a room between Chicago and Los Angeles if you were tired after a long drive. You couldn't sit in a restaurant or diner or buy a meal no matter how much money you had, and you couldn't find a place to answer the call of nature even with a pocket full of money. James Williams, who traveled to Flagstaff in 1942, said that you had to get a store-bought lunch if you were going to eat, no cafes. You'd have to drive all night and have to look for the colored part of town. Maybe you could find a room. Williams and his companions, in fact, eventually gave up trying and simply pulled over to the side of the road, slept for a few hours, and then drove on. Rita Powdrell, who took 2 car trips from Pennsylvania to California as a child, recalls that her family camped in national parks along the way. Blacks found that the West could be an unpredictable place. In Wyoming, at least some restaurants refused to serve blacks, but a North Dakota official stated that black visitors there would be treated, quote, as well as anyone else, unquote. Blacks never knew how hotel or restaurant owners would react, but they had to be prepared for the worst. As Isabel Wilkerson stated so elegantly in her best-selling book, The Warmth of Other Suns, white motel owners had a long list of ready-made excuses for refusing the black trade. We just rented our last room. We forgot to turn off the vacancy sign, and so on and so forth. So between Chicago and Amarillo, Route 66 had quite a few possibilities where blacks could stay because there was a pretty, every 100 miles or so, there was a city that had a good-sized black neighborhood. Once you got west of Amarillo, however, the demographics changed. But were blacks treated differently? The short answer is not really. In New Mexico, the black guidebooks provided listings in Tucumcari, Santa Rosa, and Albuquerque. And west of there, many black travelers knew that they could rely on meals and a warm bed at the various Harvey houses along the way, along the Santa Fe Railroad tracks, because Harvey houses did not discriminate. And in addition, at least some Greyhound bus stations welcomed the black trade at their lunch counters. But beyond the Harvey houses and the bus stations, the early guidebooks weren't much help in guiding blacks through the wide open spaces of the West. Before 1949, in fact, none of the black travel guides offered listings anywhere along the 800 miles between Albuquerque and LA. By the mid-1950s, however, this obstacle had been largely overcome because motels and restaurants, and you see some ads for them right here, began advertising in Gallup, Holbrook, Flagstaff, Kingman, and Needles. It's difficult to overestimate just how important these hotels and restaurants were to black motorists during the years preceding the passage of the Civil Rights Act. In fact, I had a chance to speak to a fellow named Richard Mitchell, 80 years old, black, retired Air Force pilot. In 1962, he left the military, headed down to New Orleans to see some friends, and from there was going to drive to see a buddy in Seattle. He took that guidebook and made sure that wherever there were listings in the guidebook, he drove to it. If it meant driving 200 miles one day and 600 miles the rest in order to be able to get to places that were listed in the guidebook, that's what he did. So that was his lifeline, he told me. But as soon as the bill became law, and the '64 Civil Rights Act was law, the owners of white-owned public accommodations, following the law, opened their doors to blacks. Black motorists, excited at the freedom that the law allowed, began patronizing white hotels and restaurants. By doing so, however, they abandoned the businesses that had long depended on the black trade, and before long, many of these places had to shut down. So, it's now been more than 50 years since the Civil Rights Act was passed. So it's a good time to ask what has become of all those motels, rooming houses, and restaurants that served as safe havens for black motorists. Along Route 66, the guidebooks tell us that there are almost 400 of these businesses. You can see 394 there. And about a third of them are still standing. A lot of them in St. Louis, a lot of them in Los Angeles. Perhaps the most prestigious of these buildings that are still standing are the Harvey houses. Not sure if many of you have been along the Santa Fe route or seen the Harvey houses, but they are splendid, of which several examples still stand in California and Arizona. Top left is Barstow, top right is Needles, bottom left is Winslow, and bottom right is Williams. But there are quite a few other standing buildings as well, and some of these are in excellent condition. Let's see, the top two are in Flagstaff, and let's see, you've got Kingman on the bottom right and Holbrook on the bottom left. While some of them are still in excellent condition, many other buildings that still stand are in poor condition, or they have been remodeled so severely that they have lost their historic appearance. So, and of course, 2/3 of them have been cleared away over time. Before we finish up, I'd like to give you a quick summary of what conditions were like for travelers driving through the Little Rock area. Not a Route 66 spot, but I thought you might be interested just for your own purposes, along with an invitation for you to check out some Green Book properties for yourself. For instance, this is a typical page from a Green Book. This is 1948, and it shows that for Little Rock, there are 5 hotels, 2 tourist homes. Tourist home is kind of a nice name for a rooming house, basically. And about 8 or 9 restaurants, along with a variety of other places that welcome the black trade. This is a listing that shows where those places were, and if any of you are interested in seeing these for yourself, I will offer them to you as soon as I finish talking, so you can check them out for yourself. There are quite a few in Little Rock, and there's a space there between the hotels and the restaurants, and then with the same in North Little Rock. So in Little Rock, and once again the graphics are kind of lost there, but if you go over to West 9th Street, between about Chester and Broadway was quite a thriving black business district during the 1940s and 1950s. And then as you go a little further south than that, down to heading west toward what was then called High Street, now called Martin Luther King Drive, and then as far south as about 19th Street, there are several homes in that area that were open for travelers. So anyway, you're welcome to go ahead and look for those as you wish. In North Little Rock, once again, the graphics just didn't come out very well, but the Arkansas River is at the bottom of the map. The main freeway bridge coming over from Little Rock is way over on the left side. So East Broadway, East 6th, a couple of others. There were probably 5 or 6 hotels or restaurants that catered to the black trade in North Little Rock. So, in conclusion, I hope this topic has helped put yourself into the front seat, so to speak, of a black motorist car so that you'll understand some of the challenges and hurdles of a long-distance car trip back in those days. And I also hope that you'll recognize that all those hotels, rooming houses, and restaurants, the ones that are standing at least, constitute a remarkable historical legacy that helped tell a story of a far different America, one that was alive and well not so long ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, we have time for some questions. Yes, question right here. Here goes.
Thank you for this presentation. My family for years traveled west for vacation, And we stopped each year to let the children swim and cool off at a wonderful motel complex. And there was a black family there who visited with our children played together every year. For some reason, we were on the same path. They were coming east, we were going west.
See.
And that family had been one of those who accommodated all. And they were very proud of that history and had a lot of photographs of both black and white families in their lobby. I don't know how many of those still exist.
Thank you for telling that story. And one thing that I'm really intrigued about as I kind of dive into this study is how many white owners essentially stuck their necks out and said, I don't care what other people think. I want to, throw the doors open to anybody who wants to pay me the nightly fee. And I suspect that in New Mexico, Arizona, and I'd say even particularly Los Angeles, there were a number of those mavericks. And one way you can tell, and once again, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself maybe a little bit, but through census records, you can pretty well track where the majority black parts of town were. And if there's a dot on the, from the Green Book showing something well outside of that area, that suggests that somebody, kind of bucked the trend, so to speak.
Questions? Any other questions? Yes, sir, coming right here.
I'm in a Route 66 Facebook discussion group, and I've even found a book a week ago Friday at the Central Arkansas Library book sale about Route 66 for 50 cents. And so what I'm curious about with this is, the Dust Bowl. You have many Oklahomans and Arkansans and others who went to California and faced discrimination there. How do you compare the discrimination between the two groups of people, what you're referencing, and those from the Dust Bowl?
It's a good question, and it's obvious that Dust Bowl migrants faced discrimination for some pretty obvious reasons. At one point in 1936, the California Highway Patrol set up a roadblock outside of Needles, essentially quizzing everybody heading west. And if they didn't have a certain amount of money or a contact in like Los Angeles or Bakersfield or someplace, they got turned around and they didn't, it wasn't legal what they did, but they did it anyway until the California Attorney General or somebody came down on them. I don't doubt that discrimination existed. It probably didn't last for very long because I think what happened, there was a backlash from agriculturalists in the Central Valley that said, we've got all we need, we don't need any more. One convenient way of identifying this topic as a historian is that there is a statistic, there is a guide that identifies places that welcome blacks, and there's nothing equivalent to that. So it's a more nuanced story to tell the story about white migrants during the 1930s than it is about blacks during the entire range up until 64. Does that help answer your question?
It does. It's something that we'll do more reading about because I've read a lot about the Dust Bowl. I've probably read about 10 books about that, so do some more reading about the amalgamation of the two topic interests.
Yeah. If I had a guess, I would say that there was a greater or lesser amount of discrimination against Oklahomans and Arkansans and others, from maybe 1934 to 39 or 40, something like that. Once the war came on, it was a different picture, and I don't think there was much after the war. Yes,
Question. Yes, here's a question
Take a
right
lot
here.
more reading to tease that out.
I've done some research on Arkansas tourist courts and motels, and I wrote the Encyclopedia of Arkansas entry on that. I was struck during that with how little material there is, physical, written, related to African American lodging in Arkansas. So I just want to make an appeal. If anyone has photos of signs, motels, I have a few green books, but that's about all I have with some Arkansas listings. I wish I'd brought them today. Any photos, anything like that the Encyclopedia of Arkansas could put online, contact them directly or contact me through them or through Central Arkansas Library System. There's so little out there. I've listened to some people, the holy grail of what we want to turn up, the people who love this topic, is there supposedly was a sign, a neon sign, somewhere around Jonesboro, Arkansas, that I think stood in the public for maybe as little as 15 years ago, that said in neon, "Court for the Colored," and had an arrow on it. And if anyone knows anything about that sign in particular, or has a photograph of that sign, or similar signs that I've heard were placed outside of African American churches to direct people who came to church on Sunday mornings where they could stay, anything like that, we want to get that material online through the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. My name is Jill Curran. If you just Google Arkansas tourist courts and motels, you'll come up with the Encyclopedia of Arkansas entry on this topic. And I mention it because obviously most of these places were for whites only, but I'd really love to get more into this topic if anybody has any resources I could use. Thank you.
I could not agree with you more. And what I find is that places that catered to a black audience were usually not very well capitalized. They didn't advertise very much. When the Civil Rights Act took place, they didn't last a whole lot longer. And of course, because of, well, it was probably housing policies or the Johnson administration, you could accuse an awful lot of the majority black business districts in towns, not only along Route 66, but in other places, you know, they're not there anymore. So in Russellville.
There's one in Russellville on the National Register that I believe is a tourist home, Latimer, I think. It's in my entry. It's been a while since I've read it, but there's one I know of on the National Register in Arkansas.
Okay.
Let me ask you a question. Given today's charged environment, particularly regarding immigrants, particularly regarding Muslims, have you heard from, seen, had reports about people not being welcomed, and not just on Route 66, but where people feel like they can't go or they have to travel at night and pack their lunches and have safe spaces to go? Have you picked up any of that at all?
Well, and in fact, just before we began speaking, we had a conversation saying, if I was a Muslim family, and would I be discriminated against these days? Or there are, I've spoken with black folks who said, way after the 1964 Act was passed, people still didn't let me into hotels and restaurants. So, as a historian, my safe space is pre-1964. So I'll avoid your question. And
well, that's a fair point. As a dean, I can tell you that I have had, as a year ago, African American students tell me to not, please do not schedule any of our field service project work in certain Arkansas towns, and they named them. And by the way, we will not do that. Not indicting the towns. I'm just not going to put students in any uncomfortable situation as I can. But I'm just saying that I think this situation is, it's enlightening about Route 66, but it also, I think, is a wake-up call of where we are today. So let's thank Frank very much for being with us.